Hi, what you're about to see is an interview with a vendor in the space in and around data mesh. We'd like to thank Nick Heudecker for graciously doing these interviews with vendors. We'd also like to make it clear that the data mesh community and data mesh learning doesn't necessarily endorse anything that these vendors are talking about, but that we wanted to give them a voice to talk about what they may offer in the space, so people are aware of vendors, because obviously if everybody has to build everything themselves, the data mesh is going to be pretty hard. So with that, we really thank Nick for doing this great work, and we hope that this is good and useful to you.
So welcome everyone to Data Mesh Learning. My name is Nick Heudecker. I run market strategy at Cribl, the leading observability pipeline company. And the reason I do these interviews is because of my background as an analyst at Gartner covering data and analytics. And I just enjoy kind of talking about data mesh topics. If you're interested in Cribl, you want to know more about what we do as an observability pipeline, you can find out more at these two links right here above my head. One is our sandbox, which is a fully guided tutorial environment. And then the other is Cribl.cloud, which is our freely available 1 terabyte a day hosted observability pipeline solution, or I should say fully managed observability pipeline solution. And so today I'm joined by Mark Grover from Stemma. Stemma is a new data cataloging solution in the data mesh space. Mark, is that accurate? Did I get that right?
Yeah, totally. And data catalogs existed for a while, and we focus on automation in the data catalog space. So that's the moniker I would use, an automated data catalog, but you're right.
Oh, sorry, I put myself on mute. I'm getting some background noise. Automated in what way? Like, you hear about automated, you hear about autonomous. What does that mean? Why do people care? And why now? Why are you coming to market with an automated data catalog at this point?
Yeah, that's a good question. So let me tell you a little bit of story on how we got here as an industry and how I got there personally too. What's happened over the last decade is that companies have collected a ton of data. And prior to starting Stemma, I was at Lyft, where I saw this firsthand at Lyft growing so fast and collecting a lot of data from their services that are providing pricing or ETA information, as well as from the applications, so the web app or the bikes or scooters and so on and so forth. And prior to that, I saw the previous generation of data infrastructure working at Cloudera as an engineer on Spark. And so what's happened to the advent of first companies like Cloudera, and then technologies like Snowflake and BigQuery that let you store data very easily. Then you've got technologies like Fivetran, Stitch that let you bring in more data from your IoT or services into your data warehouse very easily. Then we've got Airflow and dbt that say, oh, you can process your data very quickly and build more derived data sets. And then we've got your Tableau, Looker, Mode of the world that let you analyze this data, right? So we've made a bunch of technological advancements over the last decade that make it really easy for you to generate more and more data and to consume this data for analytical decision-making, insights, things of that sort. Also, we have said as companies, we want to be more data-driven, right? And so that means that no longer is it one analyst's job to look at data and then farm out an exact dashboard. It's become a part of every job. A PM, a marketing operations person, a business operations person needs to know data in order to make their day-to-day jobs work, right? So you see this technological advancement with too much data, a lot of hunger and appetite for data within organizations has led to a problem where you have a lot of data in your data systems. These data scientists or citizen data scientists, so to speak, in the companies want this. And the barrier to entry is no longer how do I use, I don't have this data, so like I can't do this analysis. The barrier is I don't know what data we have, what's out there, and what's trustworthy, right? And these are the problems around understanding or context of data that are top of mind for many organizations in preventing data-driven analysis from being done.
I've seen a bunch of companies kind of revitalize or try to revitalize the idea of a data catalog, right, in the context of a data mesh. Frequently, data catalogs struggle because they're full of technically correct information, right? What what column did this data come from? How is it described? What data type is it? But they frequently miss the contextual information, like the business knowledge. What does this column actually mean to the rest of the business and adjacent data sets and things like that? How are you solving that challenge, right? You're talking about context. It's a big element of the whole data mesh story. So what's Stemma doing differently here?
Excellent question. So you're right. Historically, the way this worked is you pull out your information schema from the data warehouse, you slap it on a UI, and then you say like edit like wiki pages, right? And so it becomes a curated data catalog. And there are companies in this space, we don't have to talk about them, but that's the norm. We've tried to solve this problem. So in a company like Lyft, if you had to solve this problem, you have to hire tens, if not hundreds of data stewards who are then going to enter this information by hand, right? And some of the information they're entering by hand is actually information that doesn't need to be entered by hand. And I'll share some examples. Commonly put thing is that this dashboard is updated daily, or this data set is updated daily. This data set is used in marketing analysis, and it's the most commonly used data set, right? The thing is, we have technology today where we can get access from the query logs of the data warehouse, the BI tools, APIs, team information from the HR system to say like, hey, Nick, you are a data scientist in the ETA team, but other data scientists in the ETA team commonly join this particular data set with this data set, or they look at this dashboard, right? And so you can look at this as a timeline feed of your data as it's changing, recommending you what data set you should use based on information that's there. And mind you, I'm not saying that automation will get you 100% of the way. I do not believe that to be the case. I think there's information in people's heads that needs to be captured. I'm only saying that there's like 60 to 80% of the information that people document and curate today can be covered by automation. And then you curate the rest 20, 40%. That's important for you and your organization that you want to surface.
Well, I want to jump into a harder question, right? I think a lot of this has been manual to this point, right? You talk about hiring data stewards. I think data stewardship it's kind of part of someone's job, maybe a few people. I don't think you're hiring dedicated data stewards, but it's been manual because getting access to all these systems, right? You mentioned HR systems. What about CRM, supply chain ERP, all those, right? So I think historically it's been easier to just say, I'm just going to do this by hand, because getting access to those systems is an absolute nightmare, right? I may not have the social capital to get access that I need. I may not have executive buy-in or even buy-in from various bosses. I could have an org chart that looks like an impossible tree. I don't even know how to navigate. So when you're out there trying to solve these problems for your prospects and your customers, how hard is it to get that permission to access all of these diverse data sets to really make the automation happen?
Yeah. So one pattern that's changing is that all these disparate systems are in organizations logging their data into the warehouse. And so we don't necessarily have to go to Salesforce to get Salesforce generated data. It is in their Snowflake instance, and we get it from there. Now, there may still be some additional information that we would want from Salesforce around that we can get from their API, and that is a net additional call that we have to make to Salesforce. But the core of the information that we need in order to get rolling is actually in the warehouse. And that's one pattern that's changed since the last wave of these products, was that because of the centralization of the data warehouse and the prominence of them, that they have become the central point where we can start integrating with them and get additional metadata to augment on top of that.
So in the mesh story, right, it's much more kind of contextualized data products, right? You typically may not have a data warehouse in there at all. And so now you're saying, well, we've got this data centralized in the warehouse. We can do much more automation. It's kind of going against the mesh idea to a certain extent. Would you agree?
I don't. I think it's actually in line with it. Let me share how I think about this. To me, data mesh has these four pillars. I won't repeat them here, but data mesh is about getting
No, repeat them. Repeat them for the audience.
I would have to look them out on the internet.
Well, there's
so
federated computational governance, right? There's data discovery. I think there's data products, and there's a fourth that I can't remember either.
Yeah.
So look it up and leave it in the comments. I'm sure we'll hear about it soon.
Okay, sounds good.
But let's go with those three for now.
Yeah, I remember the intent of each of those pillars, the name, exact verbiage. I always have to look them up. But the idea is that you decentralize the ownership of data, right? So the data team is not at the center of putting in metadata information, ownership information about the data set that's in marketing. So the marketing team owns the marketing data set, the sales team owns the sales data set, so on and so forth. In such a decentralized environment, you have to provide them tools to enable them to do their job. And there are two personas to consider here. One is the persona of a data creator or a data owner. So a person who creates or owns the marketing data will often want to maintain this data. And this means that they are modifying the data in some way. They may be adding a new column, deleting a dashboard, deleting or deprecating an entire system altogether. Say the sales team is moving from HubSpot to Salesforce as a CRM, and they need to update anybody who's using the HubSpot data to say like, hey, starting tomorrow, do not use the HubSpot data because it would be out of date. Use the Salesforce data instead, right? And so it is very much in line that data mesh puts this responsibility to the marketing team or sales team, but it's also very much in line to provide tooling to this team in order to do their job. And the tooling here is visibility into who's using your data and how are they using it. So then you can go notify them that your dashboard will start failing tomorrow because of this, and change it by this date if you don't want to be impacted. So that to me is the core thing. You still have to provide these teams the tools, and then that's how a data catalog fits into the picture. It's that tool that enables the data mesh.
Okay, got it. All right, so you mentioned you spent some time at Lyft, where in our prep call, you and I talked about this a little bit, but how did you get involved in this problem today? Like why this challenge and not another one for you to attack?
Yeah. So I came to Lyft from Cloudera, and Cloudera's customers were large enterprise organizations, usually siloed. Nick, you know this, having worked at Gartner and seeing all this. And they were
much better now, though. I feel much better.
And these organizations were often at that time making a transition from on-prem software to cloud software. I came to Lyft and I saw a very different kind of organization, much smaller, obviously. Also built in the last 5 years, which meant they were all on the cloud. There was not really any on-prem going on. And data was in abundance. And your apps are logging data, your services are logging data, and there's technologies like Airflow that people are using to generate ETL. And being an engineer on Spark at Cloudera, I came to Lyft, felt pretty insecure. I'm like, all the things I know how to do, which is like transition people, I help migrate them from Hive to Spark or things like that, are no longer the problems of the company I'm working for. And I vividly remember interviewing this data scientist who worked in the ETA team at Lyft. ETA is the time driver takes to pick you up. And it's one of the two most important metrics at Lyft, the other one being pricing. So if you want to get ride sharing right, you do justice to those two metrics. And that's the most important thing. And this data scientist had built a new model for ETA prediction. And they wanted to test it out and compare its performance with the previous model, right? The previous model is already in production. It should be logging data to the warehouse. But the problem was they couldn't figure out what the source of truth of ETA data was. And this was mind-boggling to me. The reason is, if you open the app, Nick, I tell you in the Lyft app, like, hey, your driver is 2 minutes away. Then you say, I'm actually going to San Jose. And then I'm like, actually, never mind, your driver is 5 minutes away. Then you're like, oh, by the way, I like a line ride or a shared ride. And you're like, okay, your driver is 10 minutes away. So even within the same session, and your driver shows up maybe 13 minutes later, right? Even within the same session, we measured ETA 5 different times. Each of these ETAs get logged in the warehouse. There may be 20 models in the past in production that are no longer in production. So you have like 100 columns related to ETA. And sometimes you have these shadow models that run. So you've got one model showing Nick ETA data. The other one's just spinning on the side, logging data so we can compare it later on, right? And so ultimately we had 200 columns, something to do with ETA, and no one had any idea how to do it. And the historical way of solving this problem was to get curation. So you get a data steward, be like, hey, you are the volunteer or full-time responsibility to mark the right column of ETA as a single source of truth, right? Problem is, Lyft's growing so fast, no one is going to do that, right? And I then looked at other fast-growing companies in the space and how they were doing it. I vividly remember a conversation with Airbnb, and they had an internal data catalog that was parsing out query logs and doing some sort of automation on their metadata. And I was like, I want that. And they were like, well, it's very custom bit for Airbnb. This won't make sense. And that pushed me to solve that problem at Lyft. That led me to create an open source project called Amundsen. And Amundsen was this automated data catalog foundation that would say, okay, out of the 200 columns related to ETA, I cannot tell you this is guaranteed to be the right source of truth, but I can tell you that 180 of these are no good for you, are not fit for purpose, right? And then you can dig down in those 20 and quickly figure out what kind of ETA do you want? Do you want the first estimate, the second estimate, or the actual, and pick out the right column? And that problem for me was just by happenstance that I fell upon this problem. The biggest problem at Lyft, Amundsen is heavily used there, 750 users every week. 75% of our data science team uses it every week. And till date, it is the heaviest, highest scoring CSAT product within the data and ML team at Lyft, right? So that's how I ended up here. And then we open sourced this project. 35 other companies like Instacart, Brex, Asana use it. And it was like, oh my God, this problem is real. And it's at every fast growing company that has a lot of data. And Stemma is just a continuation of that journey, helping even more companies with the same problem and helping democratize data-driven decision-making in those companies through democratizing understanding of this data.
So is Stemma a commercial edition of Amundsen?
It is. We have proprietary editions on top. Obviously, you get a managed version of the product. You don't have to write these lengthy jobs in order to integrate your data warehouse into them. You simply add your credentials and it pulls in your metadata. We have a slew of automation that on top of Amundsen that reduces time to value. Some of the most loved things here are parsing the query logs to generate lineage or common join conditions, so you don't have to write ERDs that we used to write in my past jobs. Having a Slack bot that links conversations about data that are happening in Slack into the data catalog, and so on and so forth. And ultimately, like, we have a lot of experience building and deploying data catalogs and making sure they get adopted. And that's something that we work with each of our customers just to make sure that these products get adopted, and we price according to that too. Like, we put our money where our mouth is.
So it's rare that someone wants to talk about pricing. So I'd like to tap on that if I can, because it's always interesting to see different models. So are you pricing out based on data products or some other metric?
Yeah, we price based on number of users. By data products, an interesting proxy for us could be the number of tables in the warehouse or the number of dashboards in their BI system. I find that is not a good proxy for value, right? You can price based on your cost, you can price based on your value, or somewhere in between. It's how I think about it. I'm not an expert in pricing. And so I'll share an example of Google data catalog. Prices based on the amount of metadata it stores. Classic example of price based on cost to the company, that being Google in this case. But also a classic example of how it's not correlated to value. So you have all this metadata indexed, but no one comes uses this. No API calls, no visits on the UI. Why do I expect to get paid for this, right? And on the other hand, like, you've got usage, and maybe like if it's being used, that's a really great metric of actually providing value to the organization. So we hook onto that. The only catch that we have to sometimes figure out is some organizations have one data warehouse, some have 15 floating around, right? And the cost to the company for integration may be different for these. And so our primary North Star when it comes to pricing is usage. And then if the cost is different for us based on the certain circumstances of the company, we change based on that.
I think that makes a lot of sense. So tell me about the product itself, right? Like, is it a hosted footprint? Is it something I can install on-prem locally? What are the major components, and how long does it typically take to get it up and running and start to get value from it?
Yeah. So the product is a managed product and can be deployed in our VPC or your VPC, but it is on a cloud. In that sense, it caters to three personas. So the first one is a data engineer who's trying to modify data and figuring out how that data is being used. I called them data owners earlier. The second one is a data analyst or a data scientist. These are consuming the data and making decisions based on it. And the third one is a business user who is using this to drive operations or marketing or sales, and could be like a CRO or a CMO or just a marketing operations person, things of that sort. In order to get started with this, we do not today have a self-onboarding option. So it's not something that you can just simply put in your credentials on Stemma website and book. It is something that you can see a demo off on the website, and then we work with you to onboard you. Part of that is to actually share best practices along the way around adoptions and adoption and work with you to get that adoption. And so time to value for technical setup is very small. Like, it doesn't really take any time for us to just pull in your credentials and put the metadata in. But then making sure that the MVP of the product is ready for the organizations, and that maybe sometimes you have an existing place where you have documented, and we want to import that documentation before we do a more broader rollout. That's usually a matter of weeks to kind of get that all figured out. I can imagine for a different kind of company that may vary, but I'm looking at, a few weeks to short number of months in the worst case, but we mostly see it in the weeks case.
Got it. So are there common MVP patterns that you see? Is there a common challenge that companies have that they're looking to resolve in the conversations that you're having?
Yeah, totally. I have a blog post on this topic. I'll link there as well. And that title of the blog post is "How do you make your data catalog successful?" The common patterns are, listen, a data catalog ultimately stitches together metadata from a bunch of different places. And then a lot of use cases and organization personas have needs from them, right? A compliance person may want different things from a catalog than an analyst, right? And so often I find one of the good signs of early leading signs of success is you having worked, for example, with us to prioritize which use cases and which personas you want to go in what order, right? And that's not to say the catalog can't serve them all, but ideally the way I've done this is you want great penetration in one segment of the user personas before you go to the next one. Great, by the way, based on my experience, is 80% penetration. So if you're looking at like data scientist, 80% of data scientists should be using it every week. That's when you feel like, yeah, I've like really done my job here. Of course, you can regress and all this other stuff. So that's what I see, like a pretty common starting point is to have that persona, and that can help you figure out what use cases and what patterns and flows in the product do you want to highlight. And much of that is customizable so that you can deliver to those personas and use cases.
That's interesting. You talked about three different personas that you primarily work with. But those roles aren't frequently connected to a budget or a wallet. Who's the ultimate decision maker that you see in companies that approve this?
Yeah, this I think depends a lot on the size of the companies that you work with, and often I find that there is a head of data who holds that budget, and they are the same person usually who would hold the budget for a Snowflake or hold the budget for Tableau. And in a larger company, that in a large enterprise, they may actually belong to a central IT function of sorts. But in mid-market companies, they may just be, there's no sort of fragmentation or line of businesses like that. So they may just be a head of data who may have the data engineering function reporting to them, or sometimes they have a data engineering and a data analytics function reported.
Okay, that makes sense. What kind of impact have you seen on the companies that are using Stemma? I know you're a smaller firm today, but certainly you've got some production customers today.
Yeah, we do. The impact usually, if I were to classify, it is the pace at which you can make decisions with data is increased. And the closest proxy for that could be productivity of your data analytics team, for example. So in some deployments in the open source, we saw 20 to 25% increase in productivity of the data scientist team. Like Lyft was an example of that. And then the other proxies for this you may see is that often organizations have a Slack channel where you have tons and tons of questions. Like I show up, be like, hey, does anyone know where the source of truth for like revenue data is, right? And someone responds, that question gets lost, never gets recorded anywhere. And then two weeks later, someone else comes and asks the same question, right? And so another leading indicator for success here is how many of those questions are you getting and how much time are you spending in terms of on-call and responding to these questions from your peers in the company? And we've seen a significant reduction in questions like that.
I think it's a great point, and it certainly echoes my experiences with Slack. Once it scrolls off the screen, it never existed. It's really hard to use it for anything kind of where you want to preserve that knowledge and preserve that information. So we've talked about where the idea came from, some of the pain points that kind of triggered this conversation. We've talked about what your customers are doing with it, the wins that they're having. What do you think the future looks like? Not just for automated data catalogs, but for this kind of whole mesh concept as well. I mean, we see a lot of pros and cons in popular discussion. People seem to either really gravitate towards it, or they find that they just see this, they seem to have this like sense of revulsion over the data mesh. So what do you think the future holds for this?
Yeah. So a few things. I'll start probably unrelated to data mesh and come to the data mesh in a moment. Few patterns I'm seeing. One is that I feel over the years, the skill set required to do data-driven decision-making is gonna reduce it's gonna get democratized in the sense that the tools will become easier to use and more people would have analytics, data savviness skills as a part of curriculum that are coming out of college and jobs, right? And so one trend I continue to see, but I think it's going to become even stronger, is the appetite for data within companies. Not controversial, everyone would agree with that. I also see a lot of continued investments in bringing a lot of data within the companies, right? The amount of data we have has grown exponentially over the last decade, and I think it will grow another exponent in the next decade, if not sooner. Then what's happening is that the ability to do more sophisticated analysis is being also handed out to people who didn't have the ability to do in the past. So, for example, in order to write an ETL job in Informatica, you have to be a data engineer. In order to write an ETL job in the new modern data stack, say using dbt, you essentially have to be an analyst, right? And they give you a title of analytics engineer, but the amount of technical firepower you need to know for that is a lot lower than that, right? And it's just all going to lead to a lot more data. Then there's this pattern of, okay, if there's a lot of data in the organization, who's going to be the one owning this thing, right? And one thing I find is ownership is a concept that is like a very fraught thing to talk about in organizations. And my personal perspective on that is that we will start dividing up ownership in different fragments. One could be who's the domain owner, very much in line with data mesh. Marketing domain, this person owns the marketing data, right? Another could be who's the compliance owner. This could be, all the data that has any complete sensitive information should only be housed in this particular system or in that particular system, things of that sort. They they hold the compliance keys to that. And the third one could be a delivery owner. Who is the person who's responsible for delivering it, right? And that may actually, like, I don't know how others think about this, but I think that may actually be a centralized team. That may be a team that's responsible for keeping the wheels running off the machine and providing these tools to others so they can deliver their data to their stakeholders, right? And that's how I see this world evolving. So, and the data mesh are decentralizing the ownership and consumption of data, and then a team that provides these wheels and platforms and foundational Lego blocks that enable these folks to do their jobs.
Interesting. And then any thoughts about kind of the future of automated data cataloging?
Yeah. I mean, I believe that this thing will be as prevalent as Tableau. So when you, or a BI tool, when you look up and say like, okay, I am 10 people at my startup and I need to start doing data analysis, you will not go buy a Snowflake and a Tableau. You'll go buy a Snowflake, a Tableau, and a data catalog, because that is what will enable you to start doing analytics on your data, because you will already at that point have too much data. So to me, that's the end state. And what will get us there is something that's intuitive, easily integrates with your ecosystem, and enables you to do your job without a lot of curation. Like, it's very low time to value. So just like you get your Snowflake or Tableau, hooking on a data catalog like Stemma will get you started like immediately. And those are the three trifecta of your analytics journey.
It's interesting. I think one of the challenges that people have with data cataloging today is, I've got one, you've got one, someone else in another business unit has one. And so kind of creating a canonical catalog remains a challenge, right? Once you have integrated a tool into your processes and the way you work, it's often very difficult to remove. So I think you're gonna have to have a lot of kind of rethinking of how you do all of these things. This has been really great conversation. If folks want to know more about Stemma, where can they find you?
You can find me at stemma.ai, and there's a demo, there's a contact us button that leads you to us. And if there's any questions, like, find me on LinkedIn, and I'll leave my profile over here as well.
Okay, and that's STEMMA.
.ai.
.ai. All right, perfect. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.
Me too. Thanks for having me.